Thank you very much. And also it's a great honor for me to, on behalf of YASA, accept the DPRI award today for the work that we have been doing with DPRI over the years on risk management and risk analysis and risk management. It's a great honor for me today to be here. And I look forward to presenting to you and hopefully engage in conversation. My Japanese is not great, so I'll refrain from making any Japanese statements, but please feel deeply honored to be here. The talk I would like to give today is a little bit like also honoring the work that, of course, DPRI has done and also that Japan has been doing for advancing risk policy and the risk discourse. And so it's titled From Yokohama to Kobe to Sendai. And I'll try to trace the progress that has occurred on the risk discourse in order to inform work on disaster risk management. We've heard from my predecessor a lot about hazard issues. If you can link up hazard to an estimate and an idea or construct of risk, which then can also be taken forward to advancing risk policy, and that's exactly what I wanted to do today. Shortly, reflect on the award that we are getting for our long-standing collaboration with DPRI on the risk discourse that we have jointly taken forward since 2001. I'll try to motivate this with a few publications, a few charts, actually too many I have here, so I hope you bear with me, and then a few final words. So that's what I wanted to do. Shortly, look back at what we have been doing with DPRI, and that's why I'm here today, and that's why YASA, which is like an international institute based in Austria, why is YASA also like the work that we have been doing with DPRI over the years. It started earlier, but in 2001, DPRI and YASA initiated the Forum on Integrated Disaster Risk Management, and we had 9 of these fora, 9 of these conferences, where we basically try to advance the interdisciplinary dialogue on what risk is, what risk analysis can be, what risk policy needs to do, and that we have taken forward over the years. So 9 of these conferences, then it came to an end in Kyoto here, 8 years back, I think. Yeah, it came to an end, but it came to a happy end because we decided to take it forward jointly with many other researchers and institutions. So more than 100 signed this charter of the iDREAM Society, so the Integrated Disaster Risk Management Society. And you see, I don't know where the photo was taken, maybe here, right? I don't know. Anyway, so the forum between DPRI and YASA really led to that broad-based society, which is a great success, I would say. And we've had so far 7 more of these conferences, and we'll have another one this year in Iceland. So it's quite active and happening. And yeah, 9 fora led to iDREAM, and then the first iDREAM was Vienna. That's a bit of a bad photo, but we had the first conference in Vienna. So that's where it's coming full circle. The first in Vienna, then we went to Kyoto, signed the charter, and then you see that bad photo. There's people, hopefully you can see that. Anyway, that happened, and also that's a bit of a bad screenshot, but also importantly, an iDREAM journal was created out of that dialogue and conferences. The decision was made, let's have a journal, and it's quite competitive out there, the world of journal and publications, but this journal was created and had quite a few publications published or presented via this journal. So quickly, I want to honor a few people, actually. So I'm receiving the award. So I know it's a bit embarrassing for colleagues here. I didn't warn them in advance. So, of course, there is, where is it? There's Tatano Sensei up here. There is Cruz Sensei, also sitting somewhere in the back. Then Okada Sensei, we have here. Yokomatsu, Moneta Yokomatsu Sensei is not here as well. These were important people on the DPRI side. There's more, of course, so that's not fully complete. Then on the YASA side, we had Aniela Amendola and Joanne Bayer, and my colleague Stefan Hochreiner. So there's also more people. So just saying, I'm just accepting here the award on behalf of my colleagues, and it's really also the award goes a lot to DPRI, of course, for engaging and taking this partnership forward jointly. So we had the partnership, and the question is, of course, what has this partnership and this fora, this discourse, what has it involved, what has it led to, has there been any progress, and what is this progress? So that's exactly what I wanted to trace now a little bit, try to have us think shortly where have things been going. Here, so my proposition for my talk is basically saying, there has been progress over the last few years, generally, and also specifically to the DPRI-YASA and the iDream dialogue, and that you can say that the debate has gone forward and is now encompassing a number of discourses. And I'm an economist, and this is a bit of social science stuff I'm bringing in, but I wanted to bring that in and say there have been discourses joining up, and there's epistemological discourse, so going back into the question of understanding, instrumental discourse, what can we do, reflective discourse, where are the limits to knowing, where are the limits to taking action, and participative discourse, which talks about participation. So I'm arguing in my slides, and I have quite a few, but I'm arguing that these discourses need to come together, and they have come together somewhat in order to produce useful information. So that's a proposition. Wait, I jumped, no. Proposition is building also a little of a publication here, extended a discussion in a recent publication of mine. So here the discourses, I'll skip that. It's going back to Ortwin Renn, distinction of different discourses that need to come together, and I think that's really our challenge. Why is this important, and how is this linked to policy? And so I wanted to shortly show a similar slide to the deputy director, the slide that the deputy director of DPRI has shown. Okay, what's happening globally on the disaster risk policy front, and here of Japan has been quite important, and that's also why I brought in my title. So we see here the development over time, and here from Yokohama. Yokohama had the first World Conference on Disaster Reduction, then it went into Kobe 2005, and then 2015 into Sendai, and this has been quite important. Here a few photos. Yokohama, important. In Yokohama, why was Yokohama important? It basically tried to do two things, focused on this reactive versus proactive. So the dominant stance in the 80s or 90s has been wait and see and focus on relief and reconstruction after big disasters. And of course, we've known, and that brings in the notion of risk, that this is not enough. You have to also take action beforehand on risk and understanding, for example, the slope movement before something happens, before there are tsunamis and other things are projected to happen. So the question was like, how can international policy stimulate action? So we move more from reactive to proactive. And of course, you need both. You also need reaction, but proaction is important. Also, Yokohama has shown that disaster risk is killing people, is affecting people, but it's also affecting development more broadly. And that put also that issue on the screen and made that point. So that's important. Then Japan has been the key player, I think, internationally in promoting these conferences. So number 2, World Conference on Disaster Reduction. Number 2 happened in Kobe 2015. And here also you see little photos here. What came in additionally here, so here 5 priorities of action were stipulated by the so-called Hyogo framework for action. And I think what's important to look at is maybe the governance aspect was highlighted here. Governance means like who is responsible, like who is owning, who is responsible for risk, and who is responsible for taking action. What are the required institutions that need to be entitled and need to be entitled to take action appropriately to help avoid disasters to happen. So that was maybe important to consider. And then number 3 was 2 years back. It's now 2 years already, yeah. So Ban Ki-moon was, but I think the Japanese emperor was starting it. Ban Ki-moon was present as well. So World Conference number 3 in Sendai. And this is a bad, unfortunately, the resolution not so great here. So let's go over to that. For Sendai, the expectations are really high, and I think the Japanese did everything they could. It was really a fascinating conference. But the conference was also, there was heavy debate exactly about that issue, about responsibilities to action. Who should take action? Is it the international community? Is it national authorities that should take action? So I think what finally came out was probably not fully what people expected. They expected a bit of like hard-nosed targets, like national targets for reducing loss of life, loss of economic loss. Instead, we got more global targets, with general global targets. It was just the case that this conference was like interacting quite a lot with the Paris climate conference later that year, and there was a big question about responsibilities. Who's responsible for climate change? What would that mean for like being responsible for disasters? So there was quite some heavy debate, I think useful debate. I think that led to a good outcome in Paris. But I thought the 7 targets here could have been a bit stronger, and that's not to criticize Japanese and whoever coordinated that, but that the targets could have been a bit stronger. But it also has shown that different discourses and different takes on the issue need to be reconciled, need to be taken account of. So yeah, outcomes could have been stronger, but it importantly informed the Paris conference later that year, so that was also a good outcome. So that's a bit the policy side of things, and I think Japan has been ever important here for holding and hosting, and of course like informing these conferences, and DPRI been a big player, of course, big player in informing also Sendai and the other conferences. So what I wanted to do now a little bit, try to make a little bit of case that research has been also importantly informing this development in policy, which is of course ongoing. So I hope you can see that. So the question is from knowledge to action. What happens to Yokohama, Kobe, Sendai, and then I also have Paris there. Paris in later 2015 at the climate conference, as you know, led to the Paris Agreement. We still need to see what that exactly means. Also, some stuff is going forward. And then there's also the SDG debate, which we heard from the colleague also early on, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are like importantly shaping international debate here. I wanted to have us think about this a little bit. How have we moved, like research and policymakers practice, how have we moved from considering disasters as acts of God, like accept and wait for events to happen, to like considering this like the challenges, opportunities, and limits to taking action. So really like what's happening in between and what has research done to inform that. I want to frame this around questions, dominant discourses, and research contributions, and start with the first line of action, or the first maybe period here. I would say in the first period, somewhat loosely associated with Yokohama, Kobe, and Sendai conferences, and don't pin me down fully on that, but loosely associated with that, I would say first stage was like supporting transition on understanding our natural disaster risk. So the question has been how to measure risk probabilistically, how to give credence to that issue that we talk about 10-year, 100-year, 500-year events rather than average annual losses and expectation and stuff like that. So dominant discourse has been more epistemological, so science-based. So what is it? How much can we understand? And then also the action has been, or the focus has been already like on what should we be doing. Research contributions, a little bit looking into what iDREAM and YASA have been doing, what DPRI and YASA have been doing, has been on understanding and modeling risk, and also a little understanding the socioeconomics of it. So how bad is it actually? Should we take action on disaster risk? So I'll just quickly go through that a little bit. So your risk modeling, the paradigm is pretty much understood. I'll skip over that. But we of course know it's pretty much about hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and combining this to an estimate of risk. Ideally, they should be based on a probabilistic estimate here. So that's important. Yeah, you see that here. So we talk about the loss exceedance curve and like 10-year, 20-year, 50-year, 100, 200-year event, and also the uncertainty around these estimates. So that's also important. And I think that had been the focus during that time. That's still the focus today. So that's pretty much established that this is very important to do that well. With economics or socioeconomics that many of us have been working on in the DPRI, as part of the DPRI-YASA forum and later on iDREAM, the question has not been so clear. So like a Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow in 1970, where the colleague was saying, well, big events, disasters is not so bad actually for national level decision makers, because those things can be absorbed by countries via their tax base and via just the sheer size of big countries. So these events kill and destroy, but in terms of economic planning, they should not be heavily considered. So that's what Aaron Lind suggested, and some of us then were questioning that, whether that's really that really holds true. And I think we've seen in the 90s and also 2000, 2015s with big events that this is of course maybe not the right approach to the wait and see approach. Also even for countries that are economically well set up like Japan, or I'm from Germany or US. So these events can actually cause economic devastation and need to be figured and planned, considered and planned, and need to be planned for, also like in terms of economics. And that's a little the starting point for many of us, social sciences and economics, to consider that. So it's like just reflecting on this Aaron Lind theorem, and some of us looked at that. Just jumping ahead, then this is like, the next question has been more, okay, now we understand risk, we can model it, and there's a case for economists to have us do work, but then the question is, how can we do it more like integrated and more generally? So the question being, what are the development implications of disaster risk? And yeah, also then here the question more like also involving people that can take action, like so it's also about participatory discourses added on also to that discussion. Research contributions, really broadly thinking about socioeconomic risk, risk financing tools, and also stakeholder dialogue. Let me just show a few things, also honoring about our colleagues, so Okada sensei and Tatano sensei thought about what is integrated disaster risk management. Yeah, it's disaster mitigation, reducing things, but also responding to it. And there's different lines of action that should be taken. So it's not well understood. At that time, it was important to push out. So like risk assessment, prevention, preparedness, and then it's relief, reconstruction, rehabilitation that needs to come together. Also, like in terms of like how to operationalize this using algorithms, colleagues worked on that, and you see like a chart that's standardly understood now, but I think what's important here is probably to consider a little bit that question of risk value, so how much to accept and how much action to take, and so that's more like an economic framing of things. So as we know, risk is there, you cannot reduce risk to zero, so how much of it to accept, how much to reduce, and how much to finance using insurance. So that's shown here, and that can be then operationalized. And of course, that's standardly understood, but I thought it's useful to show it. And of course, I know Tatano Sensei sitting here is good also to show that and show a little of stuff that we've been doing. Yeah, modeling then can take this on as different models that can be taken forward, like economic growth models, input-output models, general equilibrium models. Just showing what we do a little bit of modeling stuff using economic growth modeling. I'll skip over that. Here the question is, however, okay, risk. So in this first stage, I talked about risk, loss exceedance curve. What does it mean, for example, for the finance ministry in Japan or like in other places, the World Bank acting globally? So as we say in economics, savings. What's the money available, savings domestically or internationally to deal with certain losses when they happen? And that involves the question then of economic or fiscal vulnerability. And then, for example, for certain countries like Madagascar, you can ask the question, okay, now we know there's a return period. You have certain events happening with a certain return period. How much money, finance is available? And at what stage or what event, probabilistically in advance of this happening, would these countries face a gap or like a big disruptive event? And that's, for example, Madagascar, according to this chart, it would be saying, well, maybe like a 45 or something year event would cause a bigger disruption. Already counting in all kinds of additional support coming in after an event, like loans, public assistance, aid, and also loans that can be taken into the system. But then after absorptive capacity is reached, like where would certain countries hit their limits? And then, of course, this suggesting that there would be longer-term developmental problems if you don't have the savings, the funds available, you cannot rebuild, provide relief, and things like that. So there would be longer-term developmental consequences occurring. It's just one way to frame it and one way to operationalize it. And we have done that with many places in the world, and provided such estimates, insight, but also engaged in debate what that means for those places and what that means in terms of action. Just here you can also like simulate a little bit, like here this could be like GDP, simulating this over time, and here this, this would be the normal path of this would be the planned developmental path in terms of things getting better, and here disasters can cause disruption. That's probably as much as I wanted to show here. So that's one way to model it. Other colleagues, colleague Yokomatsu Sensei with other colleagues use the general equilibrium model, which assumes equilibrium on all markets simultaneously. And then he integrated disaster shocks into that system, and in order to ask, okay, what's happening to the economy overall? So it's a similar but different way to do it. And I won't be talking about this endlessly now, but I just want to highlight it and also highlight this in order to show why this can be useful. And here those colleagues looked at the case of Pakistan, I think the earthquake in Pakistan, trying to understand like how good is the model fitting reality. And that sounds like a no-brainer, but economists quite often don't do that, right? They do their models, they run it, and if something happens, they don't look backwards. And I think here is good, and colleagues look backwards. They try to understand, okay, how does the model fit reality without a disaster happening? That's here. So the model is the full line, and the dotted line is actually is observations, and you see without disasters happening, it's quite nicely tracing developments. And the disaster happening then, of course that's the counterfact, disaster happened, and here also the model nicely traced reality somewhat. Of course I'm promoting this and it needs more discussion and stuff, but I think it's quite a good exercise to look backwards and trying to really fit the model and calibrate it and think about this reality check. How much do we economists understand what's happening out there? And quite often economists don't do that properly and so on. So that's good. And yeah, also if you want to understand reality, you need to work with people and try to understand, like to open your models. You need to go beyond the black box modeling, which we have done, for example, here in the Caribbean, working with our cats and models, sitting down with decision makers in the Caribbean here, Filipino colleagues, trying to understand, okay, how efficient, what's the efficiency aspect, how much money to put into risk management to reduce risk, but also what's the acceptability aspect here and how much to build in solidarity to subsidize action nationally or internationally. So that's important. Engage with here high-level decision makers in participation. Again, also the work generally has moved forward strongly on the issue of participation. And here's another example, I'm just running through this example, where colleagues, again involving Tatanos Sensei, so sorry for putting you on the spotlight, so much in the limelight here, but here the question was like, how has participation occurred at recent reconstruction exercises in the state of Gujarat that experienced a bad earthquake a few years back? And here the question is, what are certain criteria for useful for making participation effective and leading to effective reconstruction, like putting people in the right spots, building those houses in the right spots, and having this accepted by people. I think in your paper, Tadano Sensei, you're also showing that in many instances reconstruction happened, but then people were not included in the process, and they were not willing to move to these newly and nicely reconstructed places because that's not providing them people with like a sustainable livelihood, so they didn't do it. So here's certain criteria that were checked by colleagues, just come out the paper this year, and there are certain criteria that need to be looked at, and I think that's really useful and important, and it's also not done so much. So it's really that question of participation, how do we involve people, and how do researchers stimulate that, and how do they check it and monitor it after the fact. Yeah, so that's one question. Also in terms of integration, here's about integration. So it's not enough to calculate numbers, I'm saying here, but you need to integrate people, institutions, more broadly in thinking about certain options that then people and institutions can translate into solutions. And so it's about this integrative part here. One part that we, in the iDream Society and the YASA DPRI engagement looked a lot into is this question of insurance or risk financing. And that's, the paradigm is pretty much dominated by the discussion about from insurers and reinsurers globally. But I think what we also wanted to bring about is there's also like many other ways to do it, to think about organizing that. So for example, kinship arrangements, family and friends have always been providing finance, dearly needed finance in the aftermath of events. And there is also other voluntary arrangements. International aid has been coming in. Micro savings are important issues. And also like, where is it, like governments have also started to think about insuring their potential asset losses nationally and regionally. So anyway, this was also like a big question, like what's insurance more broadly and what can happen here. And I think over the years we jointly have like, we have looked at and also try to inform action that has been happening on novel ways to insure and reinsure assets from potential losses due to disasters. And that really has happened over the last 10, 15 years. And there's really like important schemes that have also been supported by, I think, Japanese assistance, but also international assistance. And we have now quite a number of such international groundbreaking schemes that help to provide dearly needed finance to countries and communities that did not have access to that earlier on. So we see here quite a few places in the world, in the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific, and I think Japan is quite active here, where regional pools have been set up building on that understanding that disaster risk can really disrupt development, and that has really been taken forward. And the World Bank has been a big market maker here, but also we reflected strongly on that. And I think here's some link to action that we at least were engaged in strongly. Very shortly, only talked about disaster risk. Here's something for the Cruz Sensei here, also like Anna Maria. So the question is also like how are natural and technological disasters linked, and what are synergies and opportunities in tackling risk jointly, and this nice publication they have done. So that has also been a big focus of the work, the conferences over the years, to think about joint action here. And here's a nice publication that I could recommend reading. So just moving on a little bit in this like broad reflection on where are we coming from and where are we going. In the later 2010s or so, climate change has strongly emerged with a call towards the disaster risk people, disaster risk science to provide useful information. So here the question has been, what are synergies of tackling climate change and disaster risk? Yes, think about broad-based discourse. Also think about the reflective aspect. So what does climate change mean for disaster risk? Where are we hitting the limits of adaptation, for example? And in terms of research contributions, climate risk analysis, so jointly looking into disaster risk and climate change, and understanding the climate contribution. Just a few, like very shortly, just a few charts, and that's generally just some general charts which you all know, of course. IPCC in 2014 has shown again that concentrations are rising, that temperature also has been rising over time, particularly if you look into the decadal averages over time. So there is an issue here, and the issue is pretty bad and is pretty serious and needs due attention now, and action needs to be taken. So also that IPCC report that I also worked on has shown that if we are seeing widespread impacts that are observed already. So last 50 years, data series have clearly shown that we are seeing impacts on all continents and oceanic systems, in physical, biological, and human systems, and these impacts can be clearly attributed to climate change. So the world is changing due to climate change. Here the coral reefs are also being affected strongly. And with increasing emissions, risks may increase and need to be taken action for. Of course, needs reflection. What are we talking about? Are we talking about warm days or like droughts or like cyclones? And here we have like different insight that has been generated. So, but an important insight from a report by the IPCC in 2012 that actually brought the disaster people with the climate people, the disaster researchers with the climate researchers together, was clear that the extremes are being amplified. So the hazard part of extreme event risk is being amplified. Many instances. For warm days, heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts. For cyclones, not so clear. It's still not so clear what's happening here. But maximum wind speed is also like being amplified. So that's meaning is climate change is not only making it a bit hotter and global temperature increasing, but it's really shaping those extremes. And that's of course a bad message overall, but like an engaging message for the risk community to take action forward. Yeah, it's about slow onset, but also about sudden onset. So I would say actually that's a bit old. I think sudden onset has really like become the key issue in climate change almost. Like what are these high-level events that are being amplified and changed by risk, by climate change, and what needs to be done. So that's what the risk colleagues then have been looking at strongly. And for example, at YASA, we have been looking to the question, how was flood risk over Europe? So like, of course, major, like looking into a river basin flood risk modeling, aggregating those distributions. How is flood risk shaping over Europe with climate change? And given a certain climate scenarios, you see that from reported losses, so average annual reported losses, that this would increase strongly over time. And particularly if you look into the 50 events, you would see really what would happen if climate change proceeds with like high level, the world going into a high emitting scenario, increasing concentrations massively. So it would be a threefold increase in losses in Europe. Of course, not taking into account how much more action European countries would take on preventing risk. This is more like a baseline scenario, no further action, just climate change is coming into the picture. How would losses increase over time? And that's, of course, like a negative perspective on things. And countries would take action, but it would cost a lot. And the question is, what are the benefits of mitigating, of reducing emissions, rather than sit and wait and just trying to reduce risks after they happen? Anyway, so that's more Europe. We focus on Europe at YASA, just to bring that forward. Colleagues here also just done a special issue, again, on also climate change and the economics of it, and the Asia-Pacific region as a special issue that colleagues have been leading. So it has been a big concern, and at the same time, the community has taken action, has gotten together, and is trying to inform issues. I would say around the issue of risk, I just want to highlight this as a bit like general graph. Sounds like self-evident, but it's actually, IPCC tries to provide policy-relevant information. Actually, it's something that needs to be said, although it may be self-evident, but I think this framing has been quite important. Framing been taken forward in around the early 2010s, where climate scientists got together with risk scientists in saying, well, climate change is not about the hazards only, it's really about risk, it's about vulnerability and exposure. And it's about anthropogenic climate change, but of course it's about natural variability. And we all know that, but out there sometimes, if I have my students at university, they are like endlessly talk about climate change and disasters, but I try to emphasize to them that variability has been there, of course, for a long time, and there's there's a major insight that has been generated over the last 100 years that can be taken forward here. And we need to also understand the natural variability component in that. Also, we need to understand the socioeconomic processes that lead to changing, modifying hazards, but also lead to changing vulnerability and exposure. So that's very important, and that's why I somehow like the chart, although it seems for us, it seems rather self-evident. But the framing has really, this has been quite important for the debate. And very shortly, what do we know currently about these different contributions? Just want to push that out, actually. Debate is a lot still about these intensities, duration, frequencies of hazards changing. I've also made that point. But as we've also said in the IPCC, the key factor in most places in the world is exposure. More people, more assets driving the risks. We see the climate component here and there, but the exposure part is very important. So that means also we need to tackle exposure if you think about future risks. And vulnerability is another aspect here. It's also heavily shaping things. And vulnerability has not been as understood and has not, it needs also more tackling. Risks are increasing, we need to more strongly tackle increasing vulnerability, for example, housing in places where people can be affected significantly, so that also lots of action needs to be taken here. Debate is still pretty much up here, needs to be more strongly be focusing on those issues. But of course, the key response to climate change needs to be tackling the emissions and so on. Busy chart here, but the risk language that I'm suggesting has become important for the climate debate, has been taken forward by IPCC also in terms of like providing regional information on risks. So how are risks shaping up for certain regions, like I think Japan would be here somewhere. So certain risks, how is it changing over time? So from today to the future with emissions and concentrations increasing. I'll come back to that in a second. So climate change has really has had an important call on the risk people, and this is also like keeping us busy and will be keeping us busy over the next few years. And here's important contributions to be made. So last point I wanted to make on this little journey that I tried to have us go through was like, need to look at my screen. The issue now of the SDGs also, the Sustainable Development Goals coming in as well. So how do we broadly think about resilience? So no term, an old term coming in with new meaning, and where are also the limits to managing risk? And I think what I mentioned before with the Sendai debate, the issue of justice and transformation, so equity, responsibility has come forward strongly, also with the climate debate, of course. Like who's responsible for these amplifications to risk that relate to climate change, but also who is responsible for like, managing risks nationally, and what should be done about this, who should support action here. Also, if we talk about climate change, we know we're not going to these 1.5 and 2 degrees, and I will make that point in a second, but we go to higher levels of warming. So it's not about transitions, which we had before here, just doing a bit more, doing it more efficiently, more equitably, but it's about major disruptions, more transformation. How do we transform the energy system? But also, how do we take transformative action on climate change and transformative action on risks? And that will be ever important here. So the question here is more like about, it's also about learning, working with people, and it's also like, again, taking the risk discourse into, as I call it here, multiple dividends. So like taking this forward more strongly into shaping developmental interventions. So that's currently where we are. I wanted to have a few more, want to show a few more slides here. Yeah, climate change, we had the Paris Agreement signed. Paris Agreement says 1.5, 2 degrees of warming globally. This should be the target. All countries in the world signed up to that, so that's great. But, and the agreement is binding, but it's in terms of action, it's not so binding because it's voluntary contributions that countries are making. And currently, globally, we are set up for like about 3 degrees of warming. If those pledges that countries made voluntarily, so if they become true, we go up to 3 degrees of warming. And that's, but you know how much pledges are being taken forward. Globally, I think Japan is pretty good at living up to its pledges, but there's other places in the world that don't do that as much. So if those don't become real, we go up to like something like 4 degrees of warming. So double as much as the Paris Agreement is stipulating. That, of course, means that if you combine this, so here it's climate change, so this is like warming that we would get with certain levels of, certain emission levels, and here's high warming, here's like 2 degrees, is somewhere here. If we relate this to outcomes and risks, like for example, number 2 would say this would be the disaster risks. You see, of course, at 4 degrees of warming, we go into the red zone, whereas at 2 degrees of warming would also be there somewhere, but at risk would be significantly lower. So it makes, of course, a massive difference if Paris becomes implemented, if countries really live up to those big pledges and the agreement they made, or whether countries and we, of course, as we are part of those, if we continue doing what we are doing, we go up to high levels of warming, and then the question is really what are the limits here, limits to being able to adapt to these high levels of warming. So there's a big debate about that. The debate is basically then about dangerous climate change, which is funny because the issue has been, of course, there in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Article 2 of that umbrella convention, an agreement in 1992, said actually we are there, countries in the world are there to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. Has been there always, but maybe a little bit forgotten in the policy debate. Now it's becoming, it has been made more vocal again. It's really like seeing a lot of attention globally, as also IPCC and scientists have shown that climate change leads to increases not only in average temperature, but in high-level events. So like small island states are being affected by sea level rise and salinization, and we have also the issue of glacial lake outbursts here, Peru. We see here a little lake in Peru that is being fed by glacial melt. And this lake, for example, had been burst like 80 years back. It killed 5,000 people downstream. And there's a high chance that it may be bursting again, and it's pretty much clear that this is driven by climate change and glacial melt from the glaciers melting above the lake. So the issue is really like what can be done. And here's now an important debate that also needs more attention. This debate about critical risks is framed around the loss and damage debate. And as some like me would be saying, that's now the third component of the climate debate. We have the mitigation question, how much to reduce, the adaptation question, how to effectively adapt to warming and stuff like that. But the third question is then, okay, saying there will be irreversible loss and existential loss, like certain small island states going under. What do we do about this? How do we avoid it? And if we don't avoid it, how do we compensate? And how do we take action here? And that has also been an important part of the Paris Agreement. And there is a negotiating committee. And here, in this committee, there's also a Japanese colleague who had been influentially informing the Sendai Compact and Agreement. He's sitting in there and he's provided his expertise, and many others are providing also expertise here. So the risk committee is also charged and challenged here to provide useful insight into that fundamental and big question here. How do we deal with that? How do we help those vulnerable countries not lose their existence? And what's the role for the OECD and the industrialized countries to take action forward here? And it's quite a contested debate. And that has also been important for this entire discussion that has been a little bit in the background, as I said in the beginning. Important stuff here. It needs to be taken action. I'm not sure how much more time I have, but also here is work happening, and here it's about bringing in risk to that debate, which is a lot about justice. It's also like providing a comprehensive perspective on risk, and also, again, the risk preference and the tolerance part of this. And just a very short example is about small island states. Small island states are being affected by there's sea level rise coupled to high water events, so there is variability. High tide has always been there, but sea level is rising, so those high tide events are becoming more pronounced. Then the question is what action to take, and we recently had a little piece in Science where we try to play out what kind of action can be taken. I don't have a lot of time here, but I just wanted to mention that what's the important ingredient that we added on to those those estimates of risk, like risk from the present to the future, from today to 4 degrees of warming, to 2 degrees or 4 degrees of warming, risk increasing. The addition we're bringing in, and that some colleagues are now bringing in, is to frame this also around the idea of risk acceptance. So how much of this risk is acceptable, how much is tolerable, and how much is intolerable? Intolerable, of course, being that islands will go under. And we'll see at 4 degrees of warming, they will go under. Already at lower levels, countries are facing the waters rising, and the question is what can be done. These black arrows suggest not too much can be done. You cannot reduce risk to zero. Those boxes show that you can do normal things, disaster risk reduction. You can build the seawalls better. You can think about early warning and insurance. So that's disaster risk. Then you can also do climate adaptation, more specifically looking into the climate component. But as I wanted to mention, the white part is quite important. That's the novel action that can be taken, which we call transformative. And so that's action that needs to be taken forward as risk is entering the intolerable risk space where people are not able to do things as they were able to do before. For example, it's about migration, of course. So for many places in the world, I just had a conference in Hong Kong on that. A colleague from New Zealand was saying many of those islands will go under anyway. So the question is then, what do we do? I wouldn't agree fully with him, but the question is really what to do about migration, settlement, alternative livelihoods, and stuff like that. So there's a big debate about this one, and this can also be operationalized. And I probably rush forward a little bit more. Can also be a bit operationalized about some numbers. For example, we are estimating globally, the work we are doing, we're estimating globally how much are countries at risk and what's their ability to deal with those risks, those financial risks. And if they go above a certain limit, this of course indicates intolerance, or risk intolerance, and what additional action can be taken then. So a bit of work we are doing. I'm just going through that. You can translate this into some numbers. They can say, well, globally, given that climate change is affecting many of those countries, and risks will be critical and serious, how much would the global community need to chip in and provide in order to help avoid and deal with those risks? So that's another line of action that we are taking here. Last point I wanted to shortly make is also the next to last point, actually, is about also analysis here, the question about looking into the risks as they're shaped by hazard, but also risks as they're shaped by the social elements here. And that involves the issue also, we say, of systemic risk. My institute is called International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. The question is, how are risks systemic? And so we have also looked into financial markets, financial systems, how are they interlinked, and what's then disaster risk and the ability of those financial systems to deal with disasters. How is this being shaped by the systemic interactions here? Similarly, also here with risk in Europe, how are those losses in Europe, how are they interlinked here economically, but also from a hazard signal part? So we then use Coppola modeling, stochastic modeling to think about this interlinkages, the systemic risk part of this. So it's about hazard, it's about flooding, for example, here, but it's also about the financial systems being fully being integrated, and how do hazards provide a shock or contagion to that system. So that's going about the climate debate, the climate issues I mentioned before, like how do we understand these challenges in light of trying to achieve the sustainable development goals and things like that. Yeah, maybe I wanted to leave it at that, maybe jump over that. Let me just jump over that, give enough time. So it's about trying to understand the integration of social sciences with physical engineering sciences to understand how risk is broadly shaped, how can integrative actions being taken forward. And then the question is, of course, like who is taking action on that? How do we present information? I was arguing before that you need to open your models, that you need to engage. I would go a step further, and currently what we're trying to do is also like doing a kind of gaming, like as we call it, gaming exercise to inform decisions, like set people up, maybe via cardboard, like by the river basin, and you have several actors that are linked to this river basin, like water authorities, you have households, you have maybe an insurer. So you set people up in this artificial environment, but let them make decisions that need to be made in this environment, and let them play in this environment. Maybe run it over 10 time periods and let people make decisions and let them interact on stuff. Provide science into that, but then let people experiment and simulate things. That can be done with a cardboard, but it can also be with a computer. And currently we are doing a lot of stuff here, and I think that's quite powerful, to be honest, because many institutions, civil society, and other economic actors are quite wary of receiving recommendations, policy recommendations, a lot of good insight, a lot of numbers. But if you have people play it out and let them make decisions, maybe in a safe environment, I think that can be really awareness raising, but also can lead to action. And that's currently a little bit what we are quite interested in doing. So we have this flood resilience game, which we are playing. We have been playing at my institution, but we've also been playing it in Peru and Nepal, and in conjunction with the Red Cross, with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and Practical Action, which is like a UK-based but globally operating NGO. Anyway, wanted to shortly wrap up. So I had this proposition here that we need these different discourses. Hope you heard me speak about those a little bit, but also what I want to add is here, I thought these discourses are coming together, and more needs to be done by researchers. But these things coming together provide great potential for really informing action on those key challenges that we see and that are associated with extreme event risks, and cut across multiple scales from local to global, and really cut across also this science-society question. And I think it's getting there, but more needs to be done, and that's also providing a good, like this just shows also value proposition for the iDream society to go forward. Here just a few bullets just to wrap up is, well, we need more we need to also move a little bit from inter to transdisciplinary collaboration. The gaming, for example, is not about interdisciplinary stuff, linking insight from different disciplines up, but it's coming together around a shared concept. I think we need to move more into this transdisciplinary mode of collaboration. Also an enhanced imperative to work with civil society and practice in addition to policy. Of course, here decisions are being made. Of course, the private sector I should have also added that. It's about risks as they shape development, also as they shape developmental planning. A lot about risk governance in institutions, novel institutions or old institutions. How are they able to deal with the responsibilities that they need to deal with? It's very important. It's about transformation. So 2 degrees will not be reached with business as usual. For example, we need transformative action here, and that's ever complicated. And there, the last point here, like involve people in what they like to do, and I think all of us like to play and stuff like that. So I think science integrating into gameful, playful exercises can be ever powerful. With that, I wanted to close, and I hope, some of these points came across well, and we are just excited to take this work forward as part of the iDream Society and, of course, jointly with DPRI, and I thank you for your attention. Thanks a lot.